Okay, it's about 5 after, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. We've got a lot to cover today. All right, so thank you all for joining us today for this webinar to discuss energy efficiency incentives, evolving policy, requirements, and challenges. This webinar is co-hosted by the Southern California Regional Energy Network and the Westside Energy Partnership. Both the SoCalREN and the Westside Partnership work closely with public agencies to develop energy efficiency strategies and projects. Over the recent months, we've heard from many of our member agencies that changing policy around the utility energy efficiency incentive programs has presented new challenges to developing and completing EE projects. So things like measure expiration, program influence requirements, and incentive application delays are some of the issues that have been brought to our attention, and we decided that there is a clear opportunity to improve the communication channel between the various parties involved in these programs and to address those challenges in a more collaborative way. So to start that dialogue, we simultaneously reached out to our partners in the Utilities and the Public Utilities Commission while also distributing a survey for agency input on these topics. So today's presentation will include the feedback that we collected from the public agencies participating in these programs, as well as some guidance and perspective on program design and implementation from both the utilities and the PUC. With that background in mind, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar session. My name is Chris Ford, and I'm a SoCalREN project manager with the Energy Coalition, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this webinar presented today by the SoCalREN and the Westside Partnership. And then a quick note on webinar technical support. Please contact Megan Camper. She's our technical support specialist for this webinar today at the email address you see on your screen. If you have any trouble at any time during the webinar, and a team member will assist you. They can also send you a PDF version of the presentation if you are having trouble viewing on your screen. And before we jump into the content for today's session, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items that will help us all have a better webinar experience and orient you with the structure of our facilitated Q&A that we're going to have in the closing segment of today's presentation. So first, all attendees are muted for this presentation. If you have questions, they'll be accepted through the Zoom conference chat function, which is on the bar in the lower center section of your screen. If you have any questions, please enter them there. And also to keep things tidy, identify which speaker you would like to address those questions to. So we'll be introducing the different speakers here in a few minutes. We'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as possible based on the time we have remaining at the end of the webinar. But if there are some unanswered questions, we'll do our best to address those offline after the conclusion. So for today's agenda, we'll begin with a brief introduction of today's speakers and the host organizations, the SoCalREN and the Westside Energy Partnership. We'll then move into a discussion of the roles of the various stakeholder groups that are involved in the energy efficiency incentive programs for the public agency sector. After that, Garrett Wong of the City of Santa Monica will present the results of the incentive program feedback survey that was distributed to the public agencies. And then Chris Scott from Southern California Edison is going to review the recent changes in the calculated energy efficiency incentive program and discuss incentive measure eligibility criteria. And then following Chris's presentation, there will be a panel discussion addressing some of the more popular questions that were submitted by survey respondents. And Garrett Wong is going to moderate this section with responses provided by the other speakers. And then with the remaining time available, I'll moderate some questions submitted by you, the webinar attendees, via our chat function. So be sure to submit any questions you would like for a panel to address, and we'll do our best to get through as many as time allows. And before we move on, I do want to mention that the content of today's presentation is, it can be a little technical and a little heavy in nature. We're going to get some inside perspective on how policy is created and how measures are designed and implemented. So if you need any further assistance, getting information or resources on these topics, we'll be happy to follow up with you after the webinar and point you to the right resources. So the first two speakers you're going to hear from today are Nils Strindberg and John Rossi. Nils is a senior regulatory analyst in the residential programs and portfolio approval section of the CPUC's energy division. And John Rossi is a professional engineer and program manager for the commercial and industrial programs at TRC Solutions, which is an engineering consulting firm that works extensively in the energy efficiency incentive program space. Next, you'll hear from Garrett Wong, Senior Sustainability Analyst from the City of Santa Monica. Garrett also has extensive experience developing incentivized energy efficiency projects from the public agency side internally, and he'll be serving as the voice of the agency in this presentation. And Chris Scott is the Program Manager for Business Core and Finance Programs at Southern California Edison. He'll be sharing the investor-owned utility perspective on today's topics. So now a little bit about our host agencies here. I know that many of you joining us today are already part of the network and are familiar, but for those of us learning about us for the first time, the Southern California Regional Energy Network was created to help residents, businesses, and the public sector across Southern California to become leaders in energy efficiency. So the SoCalREN Public Agency Program focuses on identifying, developing, and completing energy efficiency projects for public agencies in the area, including cities, counties, school districts, water districts, sanitary districts, and other public agencies throughout Southern California Edison and Southern California Gas Territory. And who's in SoCalREN? So the SoCalREN Public Agency Program currently has 105 enrolled agencies. We offer our project support to over 700 agencies in the 12 counties served by SCE and SCG. And we provide this support through a range of services, including on-demand project management, and connecting agencies to valuable technical services to help them implement energy projects at public facilities and also other energy-intensive systems such as groundwater pumping and wastewater treatment. And now a little bit about the Westside Energy Partnership. So the Westside Partnership, which includes the cities of Beverly Hills, Culver City, West Hollywood, Malibu, Santa Monica, and Santa Clarita, helps partner agencies achieve community energy goals by providing a wide range of services that includes building energy benchmarking support, marketing and outreach for energy efficiency initiatives, and collaborative agency mentorship programs. And now that we've covered the introductions, I'm going to hand it over to John Rossi of TRC Solutions, who's going to review the roles of the various parties involved in the utility energy efficiency incentive programs. John, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Chris. As mentioned, my name is John Rossi, and I work for TRC Solutions. We are a technical consultant that provides services through the REN program. And beyond that, beyond the technical service that we provide to agencies, we also do third-party customized incentive review. And we've done that for 10 plus years. Specifically to me, I have completed and performed technical reviews for the last 7 or 8 years. And we will touch on tech review on my second slide, but let's go ahead and move into my first one here. Now, first, to be clear, I can't steal credit for this slide. It was actually developed by one of our wonderful webinar attendees. All I did was simply make some revisions and format it so that it works a little better for a webinar. So first thing I want to draw attention to here is actually the bottom left, the utility customers. So not all callers may know this, but utility customers actually pay what's called the public purpose programs. I'm sorry, it's the, let me check my notes here, the public purpose programs charge. So I had it right. It's the PPP charge. And this charge that it appears on our bill, of course, goes to your respective utility, and then it is passed along up to the CPUC. And so what that PPP charge is used for is a number of different things. One, and perhaps most important, is that those PPP charges are utilized to pay incentives and rebates to customers, such as the agencies attending this webinar, for when they actually implement energy efficiency projects. Now, those PPP charges are utilized also to implement programs, and a program that is a great program that everyone on this call is likely familiar with is, again, SoCalREN. And you can see at the top right, those funds, the PPP charges, again, are going from the CPUC down to LA County. And so to clarify LA County's role, they actually administer the SoCalREN program. And from there, LA County has brought on the Energy Coalition to implement the REN program that we're familiar with. Now, that's where I come into the mix. As a technical consultant, we are brought on to help agencies and work with the tech team to perform energy audits and aid in the development of various energy efficiency projects. Now, down on the bottom right, that brings us to perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle, which of course is the cities, which I will intermix and call agencies during my slides here. But the cities are who we rely on to actually implement energy efficiency projects, and we again provide these complementary services to aid in that process. Now, the green arrows all over the chart here are used to basically show the flow of dollars that are used for these projects and funding programs and rebates. So I want to jump into my next slide here to go a little bit further on the incentives specifically for custom projects. So some things here. Energy efficiency technical review. If the folks on the line have worked on energy efficiency projects and they've submitted what's called a customized project, then there's a chance that you are familiar with the technical review process. But I want to clarify a few things here. First and foremost, the way that tech review is done is that the participants or the main players are occasionally grouped together. And so the first player, so to speak, at the top, the agency and SoCalREN are lumped together as one because as far as technical review goes, the SoCalREN team works with an agency to develop a energy efficiency project. And one of the requirements for developing the project is putting together a package. Now, a package that's submitted for custom tech review has a number of different components. And again, REN and the agency work collaboratively together to put together those components. The other key role or responsibility that team has is addressing questions that are brought up or come through the third-party technical reviewer. And so again, that's the other hat that I wear. I do custom tech review. And so when we review these custom projects, we are tasked with a few different things. One, we make sure that the package submitted by the agency and SoCalREN is comprehensive and has all the appropriate pieces. But beyond that, the main goal that we have is ensuring that the energy savings are reasonable. And so that sounds pretty clear and straightforward, but there's a lot of details in there that go into that process. And so the third-party tech reviewer, when they go through the package, again, any questions that come up, we work with the agency and the SoCalREN team to address those questions. Now, SCE, we know, of course, that SCE is cutting the incentive checks and providing incentive approvals, but what else do they do and what else are they responsible for? Well, it's a little misleading to have them listed as just a single player. Of course, SCE has a number of different team members that make this happen. There are SCE account executives. There are folks like Christopher Scott that are in the background helping on programs. There are partnership managers. There are a lot of people that go into the SCE side of things beyond just cutting incentive checks and providing approvals to move forward with projects. But SCE is ultimately held responsible for the energy savings that are claimed by these energy efficiency projects. And they are held responsible by the CPUC. So the CPUC does a number of checks throughout the year and has a number of different processes with many different factors that, again, hold SCE accountable to make sure that savings are grid coincident. In other words, if any if any city is claiming that their project saves 100,000 kWh per year, then SCE is going to be held to that by the CPUC to make sure that those savings are actually there. Now, CPUC staff, I have them down at the bottom because, again, we're talking about a typical energy efficiency project tech review. And in that case, the CPUC likely won't be involved at all. And so I wanted to make sure I put that here to clarify that only a very few custom projects are selected for CPUC staff deeper dive. And we'll get into that with some of our different speakers later. And so again, just to kind of wrap this up here, typically during a standard energy efficiency custom project that has a tech review, CPUC staff won't be involved. SCE is ultimately held responsible for making sure that those savings are actually making their way to the grid. Third-party tech reviewer making sure that the energy savings claims are reasonable and working back with the agency and the SoCalREN team to make sure that packages that are put together are complete and reasonably estimate project savings. Now, if you do have any questions on these slides, I know it was pretty in-depth 2 slides here, but please, again, submit them through the Zoom chat function, and I will go ahead and hand it back off to our lovely host, Chris. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the overview and the 101 of the different roles involved. And looking at that, because of the role of SoCalREN and the local government partnerships, it's often the case that public agencies really only interact with their with their project managers on those teams and maybe with the account reps from the utilities. But at the whole other end of the process, or at the top of that other slide there, the California Public Utilities Commission plays a key role in the design and in the direction of these programs. So here to help share that perspective today is Nils Strindberg of the CPUC's Energy Division. So Nils, I'm going to thank you for joining us today and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. I would first want to say, briefly explain my role. So I'm in the residential programs and portfolio approval section, and my specific task is I oversee the local governments, partnerships, RENs, and CCA's portfolios, and I'm involved in the portfolio providing input on that for the commission. So we can go next slide. So here's a brief kind of overview of our processes for updating measure and program savings. And it really starts with the EM&V, and we get interim results from our impact evaluation, which Energy Division leads annually in March. And that would have give us some idea of the actual savings for measures and programs that the IOUs run based on field observations, surveys, etc. Those EM&V interim results feed into what we call as the database for energy efficiency resources update. And the database for energy efficiency resources includes measures that have been approved. The savings values have been approved, it just includes a bunch of those measures. And during those DEAR updates, we use any relevant evaluation data, updates to state or federal building codes or industry standard practice, and it would update the unit energy savings for those measures that are included in that DEAR update. Also, after the DEAR update, the PAs will submit work papers based on those, resubmit their work papers based on those DEAR updates to include the measures that the DEAR update changed the unit energy savings for. And this graph isn't totally, I guess, perfect on timelines, but it's good enough. In the PUC, things change. Then the DEAR updates lead into the goals and potential study, which sets savings targets for the utilities and is adopted by the commission. And the goals and potential study, the DEAR updates should influence the PAs and what measures they offer in their portfolio for the following year, particularly those who have to meet cost effectiveness thresholds. And those portfolios and budgets are updated annually through the annual budget advice letter, and the utilities can also update their portfolio throughout the program cycle. So that's a high level view of how we update measures and program savings. And now I'm going to go to the next slide and get more into the details. Okay, so this is what the purpose of our impact evaluations. Impact evaluations, as most of you will know, are conducted by Energy Division and are because it needs to determine savings. And some of the key questions that we look at is the install rate, which is the ratio between the number of verified installations of a measure to the number of claimed installations rebated by the utility. And it looks at, was the measure properly installed? Then the evaluators also look at unit energy savings of the measure. And to do that, we determine a market baseline. And this isn't comprehensive, but you determine a market baseline to compare it against. So what is in the market versus the savings achieved by a more efficient measure. We use field testing and sometimes lab testing. I know we did that for HVAC, which I worked on. Determine the effective useful life of the measure, which allows the measure to claim savings over a certain period of time and is very important for savings. We also measure the operating hours or run times of the measures, which can also impact avoided costs and lead to increased savings for the measure, especially if it runs during peak usage. So if the efficient measure reduces peak demand, then it should get more savings credit. The outcomes of these impact evaluations are the data and results from them are used to update savings estimates for the measures. A secondary, I guess, outcome is it can provide direction for future improvements in program deployment, but this is not the main focus of these evaluations. It is a main activity of the IOU-led process evaluations. Oh, next slide. Okay, the differences between the ex ante and ex post. Ex ante, it looks at project saving estimates before the installation of the measures, and those are included in DEAR, which is managed by the CPUC and especially our consultants, and it maintains all approved data on measure parameters. So it would have, like, for a measure like HVAC, the effective useful life, net to gross ratio, unit energy savings, etc. And the individual measures or deemed measures use the savings value from DEAR and approved non-DEAR work papers. Complex custom projects, which John talked about and explained very clearly, submit site-specific work papers. These work papers just, include all the savings parameters for, and therefore measures and for these custom projects. So it would include that and try to justify the savings of a measure or a project. And the utilities report their savings claims to the CPUC based on these ex ante values. Ex post is based on evaluation, measurement, and verification. And so it looks at evaluated savings after installation. It evaluates measure parameters by collecting field data from programs. And these are actually, as many of you may know, there's 4% of the total budget that goes to the IOU's portfolio, or about $1 billion a year portfolio. 4% of that actually goes to these evaluations. And then other evaluation techniques are used, like participant surveys, and those are to update net to gross ratios, which I think I actually didn't touch on in the previous slide, which I apologize for. But net to gross ratios determine program influence, so whether the program actually caused the customer to purchase a more efficient piece of equipment, or if the person was going to do that anyway, and then it would adjust the savings based on that. So if it was to, for instance, determine that 50% of all customers that entered into an energy efficiency program would have done that regardless of the rebate, then the savings would be adjusted by 50%. And finally, both ex ante and ex post require counterfactual assumptions of what would have happened in the absence of the program. Next slide. Okay, and so here's a kind of an overview of the ex ante process, and I will focus more on the work paper and less on the custom because John covered that. And so the DEER schedule for updating it is first a scoping memo is sent out by Energy Division, which would include what measures are in scope for the update and what parameters for those measures may be updated, and that's sent to the service list. Then there's a comment period on what measures should be included in that DEER update, and actually that comment period ended yesterday, so we got a couple of comments I saw come in there. A draft resolution is then mailed, which updates those DEER measures, savings, unit energy savings. And finally, a final resolution is adopted by the Commission, generally in September. And this whole process takes from May to September. Like in May, the scoping memo is mailed. In September is usually when the final resolution is adopted. So that then leads to the work paper updates that I talked about before. So from September, after the resolution is adopted, until January 1st, the utilities update their work papers based on the DEER resolution, and they have to be submitted by, as I said, by January 1st. From January 1st to March 1st of that year, Energy Division can issue dispositions on those work papers, which would adjust the savings values of them. And those dispositions, unlike regular phase 2 or mid-cycle work papers, are actually go back to January 1st. So it would impact all savings claimed from January to when the disposition is filed. Also, work papers can be submitted at any time mid-cycle, and they have a 25-day review process. And if they are not reviewed in that 25 days, they are granted interim approval, but the Energy Division can at any time go back and issue a new disposition on that work paper. So as John mentioned, the implementers submit to the PA's custom projects, and the PA is supposed to review the implemented work for accuracy before submitting it to the Commission for possible review. On the first and third Monday of every month, the PAs submit to Energy Division a list of new custom projects, and Energy Division staff and consultants has 2 weeks to select the projects for review. and then can issue a disposition, although the disposition does not have a date on it where it has to be issued by. Next slide. So now I guess I'm going to go at a high level. What is Energy Division's role in EE incentives? So Energy Division's role is being involved in the impact evaluations, updates to DVIR, and review of work papers and custom projects, which lead to adjustments to the savings that can be claimed by a measure. We have no formal role and do not set IOU deemed incentive levels for any of the programs. However, updates to DVIR and ex-ante review of measures and projects will often impact incentive levels offered by IOUs. And in some cases, a commission through a decision or through a disposition may determine that a measure is now industry standard practice and discontinue that measure. The only real area where ex-ante review would impact the incentive received directly is in custom projects, where the disposition would impact the customer incentive level because the incentives are generally based on a fixed level. So you get a dollar or whatever per unit of energy saved. So if a disposition was issued that cut energy savings in half, then the customer incentive would be also cut in half. And finally, and we didn't talk a lot about approval of applications, but I just wanted to add this, that when we review PA applications, we focus on the budgets requested and cost effectiveness, or the commission does, but less so on individual programs and measures. It's more at a high level, and we generally give the utilities a lot of freedom in what kind of measures they need to offer to make their portfolios meet the commission approved requirements. And that is all I have for this initial overview, and so I will turn it back to Chris, and thank you.
All right, Niels, thanks for that insight perspective on the policy development side of things for the Energy Division. As we mentioned earlier, the SoCalREN and the Westside Energy Partnership developed and recently distributed a survey to collect feedback on these programs for participating public agencies. And I'd like to thank, I know many of the participants on the webinar today also contributed their feedback to that survey, so thank you very much for that. And here to share the results of that survey is Garrett Wong from the City of Santa Monica. So Garrett, thanks for joining us today, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for attending the call. I'd like to recall back to the slide that John Rossi had shown, kind of the diagram in which the energy efficiency programs are designed and how the money is conveyed all the way down to the project level. And I think what we all got a taste of was the complex system that goes into the incentive process, or and how those programs ultimately are translated to helping the agency's projects. I think is you know, it's I think a different experience from where it starts, and I think this is a good opportunity to have an open dialogue with the people who are further upstream from the incentive process. So next slide. So I think that intent was tried to, that the SoCalREN intended to try and start this conversation by developing a survey. It was a relatively simple survey, and the SoCalREN had pulled a whole host of agencies across Southern California looking to hear from their experience with energy efficiency incentive programs to help understand where there might be any gaps, whether they are programmatic gaps or gaps in communication, and then just generally what are some open-ended feedback comments that agencies have from their experiences. Next slide. So for those who are on the call and completed the survey, thank you for doing so. It provides a good, we have a good breadth of participation across cities and school districts. Everyone obviously has a wide range of facilities that are involved in energy efficiency programs. So you're probably all reflecting on your experiences in managing and dealing with energy efficiency in those facilities. And I should note that for those who are on the call and have yet to take that survey, it will still be available for you to take, and that despite us reflecting on some of the early results right now, the continued flow of information and feedback is still useful for the SoCalREN, for the utilities and the PUC. Next slide. So just to remind people who did take the survey, and for those who have yet to take the survey, this is what some of the questions that were asked, ranging from understanding to satisfaction with regards to the incentive programs, and general understanding of how policy changes have impacted either the project development cycle, implementation, or follow through when it comes to incentives getting paid out or receiving technical assistance. Next slide. So when it comes to understanding of programs and energy incentives, it seems like most of the agencies have a fairly high, average to high level of understanding, which is good. That's probably attributed to a wide variety of things, from deep experience and history that agencies have had in participating in programs, as well as the local government partnerships, as well as the SoCalREN and their technical assistance programs, as well as the account representatives from the utilities who help guide the agencies through these programs. Similarly, there's a high level of satisfaction with the support that's received. So again, that could be attributed to the wide variety of programs and touch points that I just mentioned before. There is an average to below average level of satisfaction, or there's a very negative impact. There's a negative impact that people experience when policy changes do take place. So one of the things I learned in listening to the call today from Nils is that there are changes that are made that could be retroactive. So if your projects are, if you have applied for a project or you're midstream in implementing that project, perhaps the incentive values and the incentive values that you anticipated to receive might be different from the ones that you would be awarded by the end of the project, or even perhaps by the time you gotten an approved number. That number might change as a result of some of these policy changes that happen retroactively. Next slide. So in the survey, there was a challenge question. What are the biggest challenges of working with these programs? And participants were encouraged to select up to 3 options. I won't read them for you, but we'll talk about them in the next slide to see where the most prevalence of challenges were. So going from top to bottom, you can see that that most of the challenges lie with the documentation and the timing of preparing these applications. I'm sure most people are aware of the amount of documentation that's required and the increasing amount of documentation that's required to develop any one project. And And particularly for local governments and for public agencies, it's challenging to align both budgeting time frames, as well as available staffing and other priorities that are going on within the agency to align appropriately with these long and potentially uncertain project development timelines. The third challenge area was the communication and timing of expiring measures. So again, what I alluded to before was that some of these measures may change midstream in project development. So you might have done an audit in 1 year that told you that there were certain incentives available for a certain measure. So you went ahead and you started to develop your project internally with internal stakeholders. You aligned up appropriate budgeting and staffing to make sure that the project could be executed. But then by the time that you actually execute the project, the measures are no longer available, or the equation has changed with respect to how much money would be returned from an incentive or through on-bill financing. So there's a bit of a mismatch in terms of when these projects are able to be executed and what happens as a result of some of these policy changes. It seems like most other challenges can be slotted in various phases in the project development, implementation, or the documentation space. And I think a lot of them are more in the detail of one of the three challenges that were mentioned at the top. Next slide. And also in the survey, participants were posed the opportunity to ask an open-ended question. If you could ask the PUC or the utilities one question regarding the incentive programs, what would that be? And not surprisingly, there were a lot of questions that were generally categorized in the measures and incentives. What influences these changes? Why do they happen? When do they happen? How are they communicated? And we heard earlier the systems that are in place that influence those decisions. There are the challenges with the applications, whether, again, the timing, the requirements, the delays, the challenges of trying to align internal processes with external review. Then I'll skip up to the upper quadrant, which is the program direction. It's challenging to know from at the PUC level when these changes are being made, or what's forecasted for expiration, or where are new areas where the PUC and the utilities may want to push and turn away from. And then I think the last piece is kind of encapsulates all of the whole pie chart, which is really the communication of all of these, whether it's a change or whether it's a policy direction or process change. The communication, the timing of that communication, how that communication is maintained. That way it really hits to the end user, I think is something that leaves a lot to be desired. Next slide. So additional questions included by highlighting success stories, and a lot of agencies highlighted their street lighting incentives, taking advantage of the on-bill financing program, and the support that's received through the LGP and the REN. Next slide. Alternatively, there are people who are not satisfied with the fact that those same lighting measures might not continue forth or are discontinued now. The fact that those incentives are being reduced, and the additional documentation requirements that are being imposed upon the project at this point in time. Next slide. So in summary, what we've learned from the end users and the agencies are that the policy changes in general are perceived to be negative. Perhaps this could be addressed by changing the way and the timing of which that these are communicated, that there feels like that there is a lot of upfront application documentation, and even when those documents are submitted through the appropriate process, that there are delays in the application process. And I understand that a lot of these changes have happened within the past half year to a year. So perhaps we're all going through a little bit of a growing pain right now. But I think people generally want to have a greater understanding in terms of what's considered eligible, what are those criteria, and we understand. You know, I think we saw that now from Neil's presentation, and then a lot of people again highlighted their success or perhaps struggle with lighting measures, which, you know, for a long time have been low-hanging fruit, and there still remains, I believe, a large swath of lighting that needs to be retrofitted. So, you know, whether or not that's able to be done through the kind of the general industry standard practice and the market forces. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are just defaulting to LEDs as their primary fixture, but nonetheless, these projects are still challenging on their own to complete, and the additional paperwork and the uncertainty and the lack of financial support doesn't necessarily bode well to facilitate the dramatic efficiency targets that both the state and the agencies have. So with that, look forward to hearing from the other presenters and having a much more in-depth discussion with everyone on the call. Thank you.
Thanks, Garrett. And now that we've heard the perspective from the participating public agencies, we're going to turn things over to Chris Scott from Southern California Edison so that we can hear the program administrator's perspective on program implementation, on recent policy changes, and also the resources available to help navigate some of these new requirements. So Chris, how about you go ahead and introduce yourself to the webinar audience?
Okay, next slide then, please. My name is Chris Scott. I'm a program and project manager with Southern California Edison. I run our calculated and incentives program, which is essentially customized and retro commissioning. I've been with Edison more than 15 years now. I started off as a meter reader. I was an account manager for more than 6 years, so I've been one of you out in the field, or I've been out meeting with you as a customer, trying to work with you on energy efficiency opportunities. And for the last approximately 8 years, I've been running programs, first automated demand response, and now energy efficiency for the last several years. Next slide, please. Before I jump into talking about my first slide, I wanted to address the entire audience that a lot of the items I'm going to talk about are a lot of the new requirements that people have voiced concerns over through the survey. And I'd really like to make a strong point that our goal is to work with our end-use customers, trade professionals, vendors, other allies, to ensure that they're submitting projects that are going to not only hold up to Edison scrutiny, but also the Energy Division scrutiny. And that's centered around project quality. So everything that we're now asking for is an effort to get the highest quality audit level project submission that we can. And the goal of this is The higher the quality, no missing paperwork, correct calculations, proper influence, and things like that, the more smoothly and quicker these projects are going to go through each of the steps, from application review to project review to energy division review. If we can eliminate a lot of the little nicks that we're getting here and there where a project is missing certain information, those timeline concerns about things taking longer are going to be resolved. So please look at all of this as an effort to get the highest level project so we can speed everybody through the process with the maximum results that everyone's hoping for. So it really is a partnership. Now, a lot of people have also voiced concerns about, getting the most up-to-date information and not, giving the market time to react and things like that. Well, that resource actually exists. We have two websites. We have sc.com, which is our, of course, main homepage, but we also have a website for our SCE online application tool. The public sector program and my calculated programs all submit automated applications for incentives through this website. But this website isn't just for application submission. The landing page is a What's New page. That's your one-stop shop for all the items that are either coming up or will be coming up in the future. It has legislative information, measure information, programs, policy manuals, job aids. Everything you need is at sceonlineapp.com. So I would really, really strongly recommend that you visit this website on a weekly basis. We update it as soon as a manual is updated. If a new policy is going to take effect, as soon as it's announced internally, we put it here to help announce it externally. So this is an absolute key resource, the SCE Online Application Tool website. SCE.com is also a fantastic resource because that gives you a lot of company information. And we have a My Account page, and if you haven't enrolled as a customer, you absolutely should. This will not only allow you to look at all your bills online, but you can actually go through and look at energy usage. So it's got a lot of really key information. And I just think these two websites are really high value. But all those updates and policy and questions that you have, go to sceonlineapp.com. All your resources are there in one place. Next slide, please. Now, effective April 2nd, we implemented an early screening document. And I know some people may look at this as an additional step in the process. But again, I really want you to look at this as the fact that Southern California Edison is helping customers and vendors, trade professionals, et cetera, with early screening services at no charge. The idea is because we do have changes, whether it's an energy division disposition or resolution, or an ISP study, which is industry standard practice I'll get into later, or other items like that as far as baseline eligibility versus new measure eligibility. We are going to pre-screen these measures on your behalf to help ensure that you're not chasing an ineligible measure or an ineligible project, or to point out something that could be brought up as a risk during the application process so you're better prepared with that documentation. This screening tool has already provided just a huge value in the short month and a half that we've been using it to a lot of our customers. So please look at this as a good thing. But it is required for all projects. Every calculated submission has to go through an early screening document on a measure-by-measure basis. And our internal engineering staff who reviews this information, and I review it as well if as needed, will send out an approval email. That email is required as part of the online application process, and you cannot submit an application without that approval email. But again, this is a good thing for us to be able to provide these screening services to help level set and ensure that you're going to have the absolute most successful project possible. Next slide, please. Part of the paperwork that has been required for several years now in our public sector program and our third-party program is a project feasibility study. I recently made this mandatory for my calculated program. And you'll hear me talk a lot between third-party, calculated, and public sector. Basically, public sector and third parties programs are all based on my measures, whether it's a customized measure or a retro-commissioning measure. These are measures that I'm offering that I work with valued partners within Edison to ensure that they understand what requirements are and what measures we're considering introducing or sunsetting. So all of these programs are based on my program, you could say. Now, the project feasibility study is a one-stop document, or at least that's what it was designed for us to be able to get through an application quickly and succinctly and see that all the information has been provided, and for the Public Utilities Commission, when they pull a project, to audit it, if you will. This feasibility study was designed as an easy-to-use and an easy-to-read product for all of us, for every project. The PFS includes the narrative. It's where you would put your supporting influence and documentation, audit, savings calculations. Any other attachments can actually be embedded into this project feasibility study and uploaded to our online application tool at project submission. So again, the PFS is a required document, but the idea is to streamline rather than supplying 10 or 15 different documents. You put them all into one single document so we have everything at one place. And that's going to make our review process much smoother and much quicker. Next slide, please. I recently introduced, and it is available on the online application tool, a new influence job aid. As you know, influence has become a mandatory part of our project applications. Influence has actually been required for more than 3 or 4 years, but we've really honed in on what we're looking for in an influence. The reason we've done that again is to help our customers and vendors supply everything correctly the first time through, hopefully with few or no questions, so these applications can get processed promptly and at the highest incentive level possible based on energy savings. There are 3 key items when identifying projects. And these are titled here in the middle of the slide, numbers 1, 2, and 3. The key drivers are identification, technical assistance, and financial assistance. And this goes back to a lot about what John Rossi spoke about and what Neil spoke about in their presentations previous to mine. We need to show that if it were not for this incentive program, or the programs, I'll say in general, this particular measure or project would not have gone forward. So when we're talking about identification, and I typically don't read it off the slides, but I'm going to in this case because it's really important. We want to see how the program assisted the customer in identifying energy efficiency opportunities. And that could be a couple ways. I'll give a couple brief examples. A trade professional, a vendor, comes out to work with a customer. And the customer was not looking to do any energy efficiency. But through several meetings and through an audit and other processes, opportunities are found. The customer decides to move forward. The evidence is not only the audit and email chains from those meetings, but the fact that the customer was not going to do any energy efficiency, and the trade professional or vendor got them to do something that's energy efficient. Or a customer wants to install a new piece of equipment, and they're going to do that on their own. That piece of equipment would not be eligible if we could not show program influence. So if a trade professional comes out to work with a customer and they recommend a higher efficiency model of whatever piece of equipment than what was already being looked at, that is influence. You were going to do a basic piece of equipment and you were talked into, through the help of the program and the incentives, to do something more efficient. And this leads to number 2, which is technical assistance. The program, again, it could be Southern California Edison, it could be a contracted engineer with Edison, it could be a third-party trade professional. The program provides technical resources to boy, I can almost speak this morning, to facilitate the project. And that can be equipment inventories, testing, data logging, full-blown audits. But what technical resources were provided that got this project to move forward where it wouldn't have before? And the third key driver is financial assistance. That's the incentive. That's on-bill financing. We need to show how the incentive or the on-bill financing helped the customer to make a decision to move forward on this project. And all of this and more is described in the Influence Job Aid. The Job Aid, it has a few more pages now to it, but it's much easier to read and understand. So I'm hopefully, when you read through it, you'll really have a good understanding of what we're looking for and what the requirements are. Next slide, please. The 7 key forms of influence for every project. And again, I'm going to read these off the slide because they're really important. We want to see how the initial communication with the implementer was initiated, who contacted who, and how the end-use customer even found out about our energy efficiency incentives and our programs. And that shouldn't just be a verbal phone call. Hopefully there'll be some back and forth emails talking about these items that we're going to discuss here, because we do need to see actual forms of influence. A timeline written out is not going to necessarily be enough. We need to see other other forms of influence that are something you can grasp. We have a copy of an audit. We have an inventory list, or we have pictures of existing inventory. We have emails, things like that. So the remaining items are, what was the customer going to do before being influenced? And what was the customer moved to do afterward? And I mentioned that previously. You weren't going to do anything and you got moved to do something. Who the customer decision makers were and how the decision was made. Was it financial? And what did that mean? Were there other cost savings or energy savings options? And all of these are going to be part of the Influence Job Aid. Did business requirements have to be met? A simple payback of 5 years is too long, but with the incentives, you have a 3.5-year simple payback. So that is a piece of influence. And if those financial requirements had to be fulfilled, what were they? So next slide, please. Now, everything, again, as I've been talking about, is about project quality, making sure that all the proper calculations are submitted using the correct calculation tools, using the correct documentation, providing the required influence. So if you want to know what I believe helps support a calculated project and to give you the opportunity of having the most successful project with minimal or no energy savings reductions, these are the items. They're available on the Customized Solutions tab of the online application tool, which I've already spoken about. These are all very important, but I'm going to pick out a few key ones. Our Solutions directory doesn't just talk about our programs, but it actually gives a measure list with the coordinating incentives. That's for our calculated program and our deemed express program. We have the statewide customized calculated savings guidelines. This is a statewide document with all 4 of California's investor-owned utilities that we edit and put out together. So this has statewide information as well as individual utility information. Preferred calculation tools are very important. The early screening document is available on this tab, the project feasibility study and the Influence Job Aid. So these are all really key pieces of information. And before I move on to the next slide, I want to bring up one item, because while John in his presentation talked about the customized program, and Nils talked a little bit more about custom and our deemed program, I want to make sure there's a good understanding that once a measure goes from the customized program to a deemed program, it is only eligible through the deemed program. We have a saying, deemed must go deemed. So as a lot of you know, when we were offering lighting, If it was between 15 and 40 feet, that was a deemed offering, and it required integrated autonomous motion sensors. So we would get the question, I don't want to put those motion sensors on. Can I go through custom? The answer is no. To keep this measure offered and in a cost-effective manner, which I'm going to get into in one of my next slides, it needed to be moved to a deemed program, which is a more cost-effective program. But in order to do that, we had specific eligibility requirements. So once a measure goes from calculated to deemed, it is required to be submitted through deemed following those guidelines. But this is a really good thing because deemed does not require a pre-inspection. It doesn't require all the additional influence and information. Deemed are those really easy measures that don't require a deep integrated analysis. So we're always looking at calculated measures that could potentially be moved to a deemed program. Because if you're going through my program or you're going through the public sector program, all of these measures are based on deep integrated energy savings that are going to be higher level, that are going to be more intricate calculations. They're going to require more specific, intricate documentation. So the goal is all that low-hanging fruit eventually goes to deemed. And then when it's no longer cost effective, it goes away. And I'll get into that now. Next slide, please. Cost effectiveness. Southern California Edison is required to properly spend ratepayer funds. And one of our regulators is the Public Utilities Commission, who helps to make sure we're doing that. So the goal of EE is to deliver the greatest energy savings and demand reductions while maintaining a high total resource cost. Right now, we need to be at a total resource cost of 1.0 or above. Next year, that's going to go up to 1.25. And for those not in a utility, those are very big numbers. So the idea would be we look at the cost effectiveness of a specific measure, and if it's 0.90, 0.95, 1.0 or above, that's going to be a good measure to offer. But when that measure is less cost effective, and this could be due to baseline changes, industry standard practice changes, and energy division disposition, the cost effectiveness could be reduced. If I have a measure that has a TRC that's 0.3, that measure is no longer cost effective. It's going to drive down the cost effectiveness of the program, and it's going to drive down the cost effectiveness of the utility. So that measure would most likely end up being eliminated. But the key that you're going to hear a lot through these presentations is you already have is cost effectiveness, cost effectiveness, cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. Part of that comes back to measure eligibility. You know, we have new measures coming in, and we have measures moving from calculated to deemed, and we have measures that are just going away. So what are the primary reasons that a measure may be sunset or removed from one of our programs? Low TRC, which we just talked about. It could be code, Title 24 or Title 20. It could be industry standard practice, which is determined by an engineering study. And then the various commission dispositions, resolutions, guidance, or decisions. So I know we're running a little bit behind, and I don't want to keep us going down that route further. So hopefully in the Q&A, we'll be able to answer some additional questions for you. Lastly, SB 350, that's the Clean Power and Electrification Pathway. We call it Pathway to 2030. There have been a lot of questions with these measures going away or incentives being reduced. How are the utilities going to meet, these energy efficiency goals that are set forth by the state or even by the Public Utilities Commission? This is not my field of expertise because I didn't develop the white paper, but if you go to this website, which is on sc.com, and you type in Pathway to 2030, you can download the white paper and review Edison's beliefs behind the pathway to 2030. But to nutshell it, we want to look to decarbonize the electric sector, electrify transportation, and do a greater job of electrifying buildings. So with that, I'm finished. Thank you.
All right, Chris, thank you for sharing the inside perspective on the Energy Efficiency Incentive Program management and policies from the program administrator's perspective. So we're now going to move quickly into our Q&A session, where Garrett is going to introduce some of the questions submitted from the agency survey and give our panelists an opportunity to share their insights on some of the most commonly submitted topics. So Garrett, we've got about, I think to make sure we have some time to take webinar questions, we'll do about 10 minutes here on the Q&A. And then I'll take some webinar questions before the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, I think we heard a lot of answers to some of the questions that were posed in the survey. I'll say they're not always satisfactory to hear, but I think we all understand, being public agencies ourselves, the need for cost effectiveness. And the need to have transparency in that. So I think one question I'll ask is there a way for end users to be involved at all in the process when it comes to the EE incentive measures? And this is a question for both Edison and the CPUC.
I think Nils will maybe have a higher perspective on this. So if you don't mind, this is Chris from Edison. Let me take a quick shot at that, and then maybe Nils can give his discussion points. The end-use customer is not involved in what we're doing with the discontinuation or sunsetting of measures. Again, as we've talked about, there's a lot of reasons for it. There are ISP studies, which we don't have a way around. There are commission resolutions and dispositions, which we don't have a way around. There are title and building codes that we don't have a way around. Cost effectiveness is a key for every utility, so there's no way around that. So directly from the utility, no, these are things that are handled, I'll say, in-house and through our dealings with the commission, through working groups and other task forces. But I think Nils can probably give a better explanation of some of those items where the customers can have more input.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So there's a number of ways. First of all, and I will preface this as saying, this is not an easy, task. It takes a lot of work, and people have to follow our proceedings and, get on our proceeding list and become parties to, our proceedings. But I would say yes. I mean, look at recent, energy efficiency decisions. Parties of all sizes and in levels of influence have been able to get requested changes adopted to by the commission through comments, ex partes that have changed.
Watch it tonight.
Oh.
Hello?
Nils, please proceed.
Where stakeholders can participate, and there's ways to get involved in the regulatory, proceedings and processes. So I will highlight a number of them. So as many of you probably are aware of, there's the California Energy Efficiency Coordinating Committee, also known as CAKE. CAKE provides direct input and is open to all stakeholders. There's members, but stakeholders can participate into the business plans, which will, there is a PD that mailed recently, and it will hopefully be adopted in the next commission meeting. And the CAKE also is the main body that will advise the PAs on the main EE proceeding or proceedings going forward. For a that's more of a high-level policy group. For more actual, measure development and technical, the technical group, there's the California Technical Forum, or CalTF, and they meet, I think, once monthly, and what it is it's similar to CAKE, but is a group of stakeholders who are directly focused on technical issues regarding measures in the EE portfolio, and such as work paper development, all kinds of any kind of issue, custom projects, etc. And in some cases, they have had made some contributions. The smart communicating thermostat work paper kind of was vetted by that group and received interim approval by the commission ex-ante review team, and that's a great thing to be involved in, and you learn what measures are the utilities are updating, and kind of I think it's a great thing to listen in on. If you become a party, you can submit comments when there's a decision. That's another avenue, as I said before. Advice letters, parties, and I believe anybody interested can submit comments on that. So if, let's say, a utility submitted an advice letter to Energy Division to sunset a program, a stakeholder could protest that or provide comments on that, and then the Energy Division and maybe even the Commission would take that into consideration. And then the final one, just to highlight, is the Track 2 Working Group, and they're working on the custom review process, and have provided participants positions on that process. On like determining baselines, preponderance of evidence requirements. They are currently working on industry standard practice determinations and the guidance document. And actually, they are the Track 2 Working Group is meeting today at 3 to 4, and that was sent to the service list. So yeah, that's I guess from some of the avenues I see for people to get involved in and influence Commission policy. Great, thank you, Nils. And as a counterpoint, for all of the jargon that you heard that might seem confusing, I'll throw in one more as somewhat of a pitch. There is a local government sustainable energy coalition that represents local governments and public agencies at the Public Utilities Commission and at the Energy Commission. It's a member-based organization. We try to participate as actively as possible to advocate on behalf of local governments, and the area of energy efficiency is one of increasing importance, as there are fairly large decisions with lasting impacts that are being made, as was referenced with the proposed decision. So I encourage you, if you're interested in getting engaged and having a deeper understanding of what's happening at the PUC and Energy Commission level, please consider becoming a member of the Local Government Sustainable Energy Coalition. So I'll ask one more question. I think we can turn it over to the general audience. It was mentioned before the need to have a higher TRC, a total resource cost. Local government programs, I've heard, are not close to or are not near the 1.0 TRC, and now there's a 1.25 TRC that will be set for LGPs. And there was mention of specific measures that have higher and lower TRCs. Can anyone, including John Rossi, can anyone speak to what kinds of measures tend to have higher TRCs than others? Can I first correct something with that statement? This is Nils. Sure. So the 1.25 TRC was included in the EE business plan proposed decision, and that has not been adopted. So there is no current one until the Commission votes on that decision and adopts a specific TRC, that is not a specific requirement right now. That's assumed. I think when that was said, that was assuming that the PD would be voted out as mailed.
Thank you for the correction. It is the proposed decision, is not yet approved.
So Garrett, I can comment on that, and Chris and Nils, feel free to jump in and modify my statement. TRC, calculating TRC for a certain measure has many factors that go into estimating cost effectiveness, and there's an entire calculator that's been built that's dedicated to accurately estimating TRC for certain measures. And so it's not as cut and dry as you think. It has to do with the amount of incentive that's provided for a certain solution, the costs associated with getting that measure all the way through to implementation. So that includes SCE overhead costs, the costs of technical consultants, the cost of the REN program if the project were to come through the REN program. So it's hard to say what measures are truly cost effective and would be, a silver bullet, so to speak. I know that some of the street lighting measures were not cost effective because of the amount of rebate that was being provided. That led to some of the revisions of those rebates for street lights historically. Chris, do you know of are there some well-known truly cost-effective measures? Because the only ones I have experience with are those where the rebates have been revised down or eliminated because they were not cost-effective. So, I mean, what comes to mind for me would be something like a pool pump VFD. I know those projects, they have high savings, reasonable incentives, quick payback, and it doesn't take a lot of technical assistance or program assistance to get those projects completed. Any thoughts on that, Chris?
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you what our highest cost-effective items are. The VFD pool pump, it's a good item. It's not cost-effective, which is why we're offering it still in the calculated program. There are some VFD offerings and pump offerings on our DEEM program as well. But it may be a good example, though, to show, even just from a market perspective, why an incentive may be changed. You're not going to typically see that happen in the calculated program. I have a set incentive amount, depending if it's going to be a retrocommissioning measure or a customized measure. But you might see incentives adjusted in our deemed program. I used to be the deemed program manager. I no longer am, but I can speak to it a little bit. And, we do market studies, and other utilities do market studies. So, we look at what technologies are going for in the marketplace. And the idea is our incentives should be geared to try to get that customer to take that step to that more efficient piece of equipment. But if we're paying the 100%, the marketplace value of what a measure is, our incentive is actually overpriced. The incentive should be one factor in doing the project. So, or we also don't want to be overpaying incentives. Something is $100 in the marketplace and we're offering a $120 incentive. Well, that incentive is too high and we're going to have a bad TRC for that because we're overpaying for those savings based on not just on the measure, but like what was discussed about all of our costs to run these programs. So that's a good way to look at a lot of these, because in custom, I am not reducing incentives on a measure by measure basis.
Great, thank you, Chris. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over here. I've got a couple questions from the audience that I'd like to get to, and one of them kind of dovetails on that response there. So, referring to deemed rebates. So, actually, this question might be better directed towards Nils. And the question is, with new policy mandates and CPUC discussion of normalized metered energy consumption and economical smart meter data, are we going to see the rebate structures and drivers going move more towards EM&V as opposed to deemed savings? more of the ex post perspective on savings. And will this lead to a greater alignment of energy efficiency and climate goals for building industry practices and quality of installation?
Well, I could speak to that. That's, I think, really TBD. Now, PG&E has certainly moved towards that pay-for-performance model in their residential sector as a kind of a replacement of the whole house program and for a lot of their residential retrofit programs. With the third party, with us moving towards 60% in 2022, and the third parties, designing the incentives, I expect we'll see more of the P for P, but it really is still too early to tell. Like, we have PG&E kind of leading the pack, but the others are still have SE as a program, but the others are a little bit behind. It does, in some ways, I think, if it can, I guess we will see if it's able to be cost effective. I mean, that's going to be the ultimate determine, how the move towards P for P versus deemed. But increasingly, and to be frank, over time, deemed savings are always going to, become less and less for the current measures as, industry standard practice changes and stuff like that until we get, new deemed measures. So I hope that answered the question. But yeah, I think it's too TBD, but likely.
Okay, thank you for sharing that perspective. So we've hit 11 o'clock. I do have one other question for Nils about regarding the DEER and work paper process. I'm going to share this with Nils offline, and we'll get that response back to the person who submitted it after the call. So I apologize for running short on time here, but I'd like to go ahead and get to our closing remarks, which is just mainly to thank everybody who attended the webinar today. Thank you all for joining us and for submitting questions, for participating in the survey and helping help develop the content for today's presentation. Also, a big thank you to all of the speakers. Personally, like to thank Chris Scott of SCE, Garrett Wong of Santa Monica, Nils Strindberg from CPUC, and John Rossi from TRC Solutions. I'd also like to thank Taylor Chamberlain and Megan Camper who helped with production for today's presentation. So. A couple reminders. So the 9th annual Statewide Energy Efficiency Forum being hosted by the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative in Sacramento a little bit later in June. We'll be featuring a panel discussion similar to this presentation, but for a statewide audience. So there'll be members from the other state utilities there, and we'll be addressing some similar questions and getting some more perspective on the direction of these programs. Also, for the attendees, a follow-up survey will be issued after the webinar ends. If you have questions regarding today's presentation that were not answered during this webinar, please include them in your survey response, and we'll do our best to get responses to those. And also, a recording and a PDF copy of the slides for this webinar will be available for public use, including the links to the resources provided. That'll be sent in a follow-up email as well. So thank you all again, and I apologize for running over time, but we appreciate your participation in the webinar today, and I hope you all have a nice day and a great weekend.